was first becoming Langley Field in June of 1917 when they were analyzing what the U.S. was going to start building as a bomber, a reconnaissance aircraft, a fighter for mass production for the Allies, not just for the U.S. but for the Allies. At the time, they bought the Voisin, they bought our Caudron G4, which is out on the floor here, and they also bought a Farman, which the wings are in the collection at the moment. The rest of it is gone. You notice that unlike the aircraft that is actually hanging, there was no squadron insignia on the nose. Again, you can't see any indication of a squadron insignia. This is still at Langley. You notice they've got markings on the rudder, which are there. They did some work with the external bomb carriage as well as using the bomb bay itself. This was the document notifying the people that are they're shipping and receiving to expect this aircraft coming in. You notice the D.C. Ravenel was formerly in charge of the National Museum, which is the Smithsonian. The old building they're referring to is the Arts and Industries building. And the three aircraft were the Voisin, the Caudron, and the Farman. And we got some communications from the Army Air, or from the Signal Corps Air Service saying that the Farman was complete and the Voisin and the Caudron didn't include engines or instruments. Then the official receiving report said that the Voisin lacked an engine, the Caudron didn't have engine or propellers, and the Farman was missing wings, engine, and propeller. So one wonders where everything was, but when you figure they shipped 6 boxes and 1 crate was how it was described. And the parts for all 3 aircraft were just within those boxes and crates, not really distinguished. So there wasn't 1 box of Farman, 1 box of Caudron. There was just random, take it off, throw it in a box. When the time came to, this was in August of 1918, and when they arrived, I particularly loved that if they're too large to come inside, they can be put in the park somewhere until they can be unpacked. This is the National Mall at the present, so you can imagine what that would have been like. At the Smithsonian's request, Army Air Service provided a sergeant to help in putting these aircraft back together. Yet another instance of foresight. Ravenel is writing to the Professor Holmes, who was the head of the Smithsonian Anthropology Department. Now, at the time, the Division of History, who received the aircraft, was under the Department of Anthropology. And look what has happened now. I suppose examples of aircraft will come to us from time to time and may be installed over the courts in various portions of the old building. Remarkable foresight. Here is the Voisin in the old Arts and Industry building. Again, you can't see any markings on the rudder. There was no engine in there. That got tracked down later on. This was prior to restoration, but this is in the Garber facility. You can notice there's staining on the wing. There's the tearing in the fabric. For a long time, the aircraft was up in arts and industries until about 1928. Then it was taken down into pieces and stored who knows where until the Garber facility was set up, and then in one of the various buildings out at Garber, again still in pieces until shortly before the restoration, when it was put together at this point. I'm guessing the time frame for this would have been 1989, 1990. But again, clean nose, no squadron insignia. Here's a flechette they actually found during the process of restoring it. The flechette, like the aircraft, is now up at in the World War I gallery out at the mall. But it, what was this doing in the bomb bay if, as the Smithsonian earlier thought, was a brand new aircraft? And if it was not a brand new aircraft, even so, were they using flechettes during the time that this particular aircraft was around?
Not likely.
Yeah. The only theory I can come up with is that maybe they used to pack flechettes around the bombs so that when they opened the bomb bays, there would be the load of flechettes come crashing down, and then the bombs come after them.
Cluster bomb.
Yeah, because we've got these things to get rid of, and can't play darts with them, they're too heavy.
They still can mess up your day.
And here's the aircraft as it is displayed now, but you'll notice that squadron insignia on the nose. I probably will need to look at the actual remaining fabric to see if that had been overpainted before it got to us, because that doesn't exist anywhere else.
What squadron was it?
VB 109.
Thank you, John. But we have so far been working on the lower right wing. You can see the upper surface, the innards opened out, and the lower surface. This isn't the first time that the wings have been looked at. Obviously, they were checked over for as part of the restoration when Ann and Carl were taking not this Carl, one of the people in the preservation and restoration unit were taking the old fabric off and replacing it with the current covering. At that time, in addition to their looking at it, samples were sent out to the Smithsonian's Conservation Unit and to Alan Tully, who did analysis of the pigments and the finish and all that. By the way, that black and white zebra stripe is 1 meter long and 10 centimeter markings. So you've got an idea of what the scale is here. Now, the construction on this was interesting. You notice they've got rib pockets on alternatings on the upper surface and on the lower surface. So presumably they put the ribs in there, folded the wing together, and then ran the main spar through along there to hold everything together with just leading and trailing spars. But here's the lower right wing and the upper right wing. Again, top, the inside. These are actually this is one piece of fabric, so joined at the leading edge. And Josephina, who I was lucky enough to be working with on the Albatross as well, she did much of the packaging of that. If you remember, I did a work in progress on that the last presentation. Is doing as I said, a detailed study of this. She's working with the Museum Conservation Institute people and checking back with the people who've done previous research. But she's documenting the condition of the fabric, the type of the fabric, and the pigments and so forth, but I'll let her tell you about that.
Thank you so much, John. Good afternoon, everyone. So as he said, my name is Maldonado, and hopefully when you guys are done here, you'll be ready to go eat lunch. But to say a little bit more about myself, as Carl had also mentioned, I am a contractor at the Air and Space Museum. I do work at the Garber facility. I am part of a team that was rehousing medium-sized artifact objects for long-term storage and transport. The team basically has rehoused about 300 objects, and they did range from airplane models, aviation trophies, to a little bit more larger objects such as a B-17 turret and also satellites. In terms of my background though, I do have a degree in chemistry and I have a degree in art history. And those combined make for a wonderful field in art conservation. That is what I'm working toward, but that is my background as well. So in terms of the rehousing and a lot of the work that I've been doing, I do come from more of that museum studies, conservation perspective versus aviation history or even historical perspective. So the rehousing in general, the team was responsible for selecting archival materials that would then be in direct contact with the objects, and therefore the archival materials could not cause any further damage or any harm to whatever the object was. So in order to know what kind of archival materials to use, that is required that we understand the material science of the field. So the Voisin VIII, I know that we've saved a little meter stick to kind of give you an idea of the size, but there are 4 textile pieces, and they're each approximately about 25 feet by 6 feet. And when I say 6 feet, that's this size. So this is not the spread right here. So it's probably around 12, 13 feet when it's actually spread out. And even then, the wings that would actually, the actual fabrics that would have been on the top part, of the biplane, those are much longer in terms of the width versus the ones that are more towards on the lower wings. So the challenges that are presented is, number one, the size. The team has never had to deal with objects that are this size, and I don't think there's too many in the collections department at Air and Space that's had to deal with objects of this size. So normally, under museum standards, these would be rolled. These would be rolled to prevent any creases, and that way when they're stored, they're not going to have any potential damage done to either side of the surfaces. From what you can see here, I don't, John, can you manipulate these, or can we zoom in?
You want to look at the,
Yeah, you could zoom in. Let's see that there.
you want the upper or the lower one?
Either one. So the reason I'm having him call up some pictures is because he, as his high resolution project is, he can zoom in. But the Voisin has a lot of tears, which you saw overall, but there's wrinkles, there's buckling of the fabric, there's punctures, and that's just the things that you can see. But at the examination level, you get down further to seeing things that are, here we go. Now we can make it up nice and big. The second challenge with regard to the Voisin is the condition. So obviously there's tears, that's one of the conditions, but we're also dealing with, as he mentioned.
You can just mouse and drag around.
Okay.
Oh, the mouse right here should work too.
Oh, does it?
Yeah. So, no, it's, yeah.
As John already mentioned, there are stains and discolorations, but in particular, we have a lot of, could you zoom in on?
Okay.
We do have what we call accretions in the field, but basically it's paint on what we consider the wrong side. Like the paint should all be on the exterior edges, not here on the interior sides. And one of the things that we can't zoom in and hear is there's layers and layers of thick, heavy dirt. Dirt from all the years that's been out in its nature, and dirt from storage, all kinds of dirt. So for the rehousing aspect of it, my job, for some of you that are familiar with the field of conservation, we're not doing a restoration. We are not gonna make this look as beautiful as what you see already at the mall. Our job is to stabilize this so that for future reference, we can always take a look and see how it was. We can continue to do research on this. I wanna stress that importantly. So the first step of the rehousing, though, it has nothing to do with the rehousing. It's actually the condition survey, the condition report. John's already mentioned that. That is detailing not just where that, oh, there's tears and cracks, but where exactly. If I had to make a grid system, I could tell you exactly how long of the tear is. These tears can vary up to 25 inches to the tear going through the entire length of just one side. Currently, 2 out of the 4 fabrics have been assessed. And when I say assessed, though, again, it's noting where all the damage is, how much of the dirt. But the unique thing that these wing fabrics have is that they can be considered paintings. And so you're like, what do you mean a painting? Well, the dope layer, as John had already mentioned, and from prior analysis, we know it has pigment. You can see from the red and the blue and the gold and any of the silver, there's pigment in there. So then what does that mean? So then we can consider that dope to be a paint layer. And then the paint is on the textile fabric, which is usually the canvas, if you will. So noting that if we can generalize and call it a painting, then we're gonna see some of the damage that you would see in paintings. The paint layer is cracked. The paint layer is separating from the actual textile. We're seeing some of the stains that could just be superficial dirt, because paintings can get dirty just on the superficial side. The next thing to consider is, this is a textile. So from a textile conservation perspective, what are we focused on? Most of it actually has to do with things that you really need to get down and deep to analyze. So we're talking about the weave pattern. We're talking about what are the actual weave, the threads made of. More than likely, this is linen. Most people will say, oh, that's a given. That's a given from the literature, and that's a given from even prior analysis. However, I want to know, well, are we certain it's linen? Maybe it's some sort of a composite linen. Perhaps they use some cotton as well. They use flax of some other sort. A lot of research had been indicating that the French were using, or at least experimenting with silk. So rest assured, this is not silk. Couldn't use that. It wouldn't be in this condition if it had been silk, because silk deteriorates so much more horribly than cotton or linen or any other type of plant-based fabric. So when we're looking at the textile, we want to know what's the weave pattern. There's so many types of weave patterns, and does that really matter? It can, because some of the damage that we might see, any defects because of the weave pattern, because of the weave structure, could inadvertently be affecting the paint layer, as we have mentioned already. And in addition to John taking excellent photographs about, so I can point out to you, oh, look here for this, look there for this other thing. At the examination level, I'm gonna have to be able to talk to other material scientists and other conservators about what's going on with this. So the information has to get as detailed as possible. But what's the next step? Right now, I already mentioned that we've examined 2 of the 4 fabrics. Once we can examine all of them, we can get an overall assessment of what are the generalized types of damage that we have. Before we can begin any rehousing, we need to be able to address the fact that, as I mentioned, this has wrinkles, this has creases, at the fabric tears. That one of the things that you may not have been aware of, but when the fabric at the tears, they curl towards the paint layer, towards the dope side. Why is that? There's a reason behind it, which I still have to investigate. But knowing that they all have a similar pattern of how they curled, now we can address all of these tears, so that what we want to do ultimately is flatten, what we call flatten, but it's relaxing the fabric. Why do we need to relax it? Because if we try to fold it as is, those curl tears, they're just going to get worse. The creases, they'll start to create new tears. We need to be able to relax all the fabric. Some of the edges, because of how they were handled or because of how they were cut off of the actual wings, they might still have some of the adjacent fabric on it. Well, then that's an actual corner. How do we relax a corner? Well, that'll be an interesting prospect when we get to that point. But once we can actually relax this fabric, then we'll be able to move on to the next step. Now, because I did mention that this is not a restoration, but just a condition, a stabilization of this fabric, any of the tears, we may not have to necessarily patch them back together. Any of the lifting of the paint layers, that might have to be addressed, because if, otherwise some of those cracks would, some of that dope will crack off. And then what do? We need to find, currently a lot of the pieces that are just falling off, we try to collect them into little bags for preferably research purposes, but we don't want that to continue to happen. So we may have to address some of those by trying to glue them back down. I say glue, but it'll be a little bit more technical in terms of how do we reattach that lifting dope layer onto the fabric. Another thing that we're addressing are some of the stains. Some of those stains actually are causing the tears, and specifically we're looking at the what I call the grommet strip. I think you guys have a technical term for that. At the trailing edges, we need to know chemically what's going on there, because if it's something that's going to continue to deteriorate, then we need to stop it before it'll continue to do any more damage. And that's where we have to go into the chemical analysis and again, literature review. If it's possible to know what the dope is made of. Now, according to the research, and many of you may already know, the French used cellulose acetate around this time period as part of the dope. So with analysis, maybe we'll find that there was something else, cellulose nitrate, maybe a combination of the two. The prior research indicated that it was just strictly cellulose acetate, and again, they were also referencing a lot of the French literature. But at this point, we want to be absolutely certain, if possible, to make sure that it is all just cellulose acetate. And we know that cellulose acetate can be dissolved in acetone. Not the same acetone you would use to take off nail polish for all of you that paint your nails, but a more high-grade kind. And we can't just apply the acetone then, because then it'll dissolve and we're going to completely destroy it. So what we'll want to do then is, knowing some of those chemical properties, can we create some type of solution that'll help us to, again, chemically relax the dope layer as well, because we don't want to just treat the fabric, we have to treat that paint layer as well. I think that's in terms of the chemical analysis. Once we can relax this, then we can address the concerns of rehousing. Again, we're aiming to roll the fabrics, but maybe that might not be the best approach for this one. Again, we would be more hesitant to just fold it and fold it again and fold it 3 or 4 more times, because we'll create more of the damage that we're already assessing. So at this point, rolling is what we want to do, but we'll know for sure. And then once it's rolled, we'll get back to my original role in building the enclosures that will actually transport these here to Hazy for long-term storage. And that's actually all I have to say. If there are any questions for either me or John. Yes, sir.
The dope in the case of the Voisin VIII, is that aluminum silver on the upper surface?
There is aluminum. There is aluminum in the dope.
Yeah,
That's
there's
correct.
aluminum pigmentation in all the upper and lower surfaces.
Which you try to reproduce in the
Yeah,
That is
now
correct.
That's correct, yeah.
NASM.
Yeah.
Did you do it the same way the French supposedly did, by mixing aluminum powder in with the dope?
Okay, we were not involved in that. To the best of my knowledge, the techniques that Ann and Carl used were as close as they could get to that, but I do not know, for that matter, I do not even know for a fact that they used cellulose acetate dope. We don't know in the restoration.
Actually, let me not. So the researcher that he mentioned earlier, Alan Toll, thank you. In his report, which I had to read, he did indicate, okay, if it's cellulose acetate, what can we use? He mentioned a type of varnish that could be replicated. Is it identical? No, it's not identical, but he did try to assess it. The same thing with the pigments. When he found out what are some of the components of the pigments, he was able to then direct the restoration team on how to best combine what he found in terms of like, oh, it has this percentage of iron, this percentage of lead, this percentage of whatever element was in there, to try to find the closest resembling combination. So with regard to the silver in this dope, he more than likely also was able to determine how much to add to give it the saturation of silver that you see. But in terms of cellulose acetate, he couldn't replicate it only because there were so many recipes that the French used, and a lot of it was kept secret. So unless I can have access to those documents to then try to finally see what was there. But Alan Toll, I believe he may have had access to those documents and literature. But again, it just would have been difficult to try to reconstitute all over again. So it was just better for him to come up with the best substitute. Any other questions?
Was it, when it was originally put away in about 1990, was it folded?
Yeah, I didn't know if he was gonna have pictures of it. It's horrifying from a museum collection perspective, but it was put in a wooden crate, and wood is a terrible thing to store anything in for long-term longevity. But it was folded, and so a lot of the creases that we see are just from those folds. Basically, they folded it in half and then just did as many folds as they could, stuffed all 4 of them into the same wooden crate with any of the additional hardware that they had, so petrified tires, nuts and bolts.
The Voisin, with the exception of the one wingtip that I showed in an earlier thing, was in a box that was about 3 feet wide, 4 feet high, and 8 or 9 feet long. Everything that did not get used in the restoration. Charlie?
I would say to those of you who volunteer and are employed at the museum, I think you have to remember that when you inherit these objects from prior people at the museum,
Standards have changed.
and standards have changed, but I can tell you even today, in my experience working with museums in France and other countries, the Smithsonian is light years ahead of other museums today. In that there are aircraft which are restored, say, in the last 15, 20 years at Air and Space outside of Paris and Brussels, where the technique in restoration is to take original fabric, remove it from the aircraft, and either throw it away or give it away. And there's absolutely no effort, and we're talking in the last 10, 15, 20 years, no effort at the French Air and Space Museum to save or preserve fabric. The Smithsonian has been collecting and storing and saving and preserving, for close to 100 years. And even today, we are so far beyond what other museums and museum staff are interested in doing. One of the things I'm working on actually now is I have a piece of the Voisin that was restored at the Air and Space Museum. They sent me a piece. I've worked with them before. And when I had no idea I was going to receive a piece, and when I opened it, I was really surprised that they would send me on one hand, it was wonderful to receive a gift like that. But on the other hand, it was amazing that a museum could restore the aircraft and give away.
You mean the Musée de l'Air?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
So
Not the Smithsonian. The
No,
French-
not the Smithsonian,
French,
I'm
yeah.
sorry. The museum.
Yeah.
So I think, just although at times it seems like, things have been folded and put away and so forth, and at least this, the Smithsonian preserves and keeps, whereas museums take off fabric and often other things, wooden parts, and throw or give or sell or whatever. So I compliment you all in what you're doing, that you guys are so far beyond what other museums today are doing.
Thank you, Carl, for not throwing it out.
To make it a sidebar to what Charlie said, there is a long-standing tradition that when fabric from an aircraft is removed, it is considered disposable. And it's always been that way. It's been very, and Carol will probably talk about this, it's been a long-standing tradition that it's disposable, it's not retained. And so those individuals in other museums are probably trained on fabric, replacement on aircraft, just look at it in those terms without thinking about the historic significance of it. And one of the reasons we're dealing with this is there are two aspects to that. One is we need to rehouse and move the collection into storage. And a wood crate is not a means of doing it. And then just taking this fabric as it is and just putting it on a pallet is not within the standards of what we do. So we have to find a better means of rehousing it. And to do that, we have to go to the lengths that we're going right now to make that determinant what is the best way to retain it so that in 100 years from now, it's not just a pile of threads, that it has some value to it and that it can be examined if need be. So,
A question?
As a final sidebar to that, 40 years ago when the Albatross was done, the fabric was chopped into 2-inch squares,
Yep.
put on poster board and sold to raise money, I guess, for the
Yeah.
restoration.
I don't know how much money it raised.
It was beyond throwing it away. I mean, it was actually chopped up and sold.
Yeah, they also did that with the original Wright fabric.
Say what?
The original Wright flyer fabric was done the same.
No, same way.
That was done by, I think by Museum of Science in London, because by the time we got the right flyer,
Well,
that
the
would have been
fabric that was on it when we last covered it was sold.
Yeah.
There were a few aircraft that were done like that. That was
Well,
the thing to do at the
no,
time.
they sold off the VIII Fizz,
Yeah, Vin Fizz.
not the original, because that was clearly restoration.
and for any of
They did
you
about
who are
80.
really interested, just go into the aerodrome and you'll see the long conversation that I had with an individual down in Texas regarding the whole question of cutting up fabric and then distributing it to the public as opposed to holding on to it.
For one thing, it's not ethically right anymore.
Right.
It's
If they-
part of the artifact.
If they had done that in 1991 with this fabric, you'd never be able to see this. And in 20 years' time, should somebody get approval to re-examine the fabric, I'm sure that they will have improved techniques and there'll be even higher resolution, image capture is better. But once it's cut up into 2 and 3 inch squares, the
I'll
fabric
just-
may be around, you can't do anything
I'll
with it.
defend the Musée de l'Air, though. The one where they are ahead of us was with Guynemer's Stat 7. They saved the whole fabric and were able to do that, and we're actually doing some of that with black bait now, with its applications. So that was a real
Well,
inspiration
probably
for
because
us.
Guynemer is
Is a saint in
borderline
France.
saint.
Yeah, no, yeah,
But
there's a
still.
reason for it, but they
Yeah.
did do that and
Right.
successfully do that.
Oh, that aside, that particular SPAD was the first operational one with the 180 horsepower engine. He scored a lot of his victories in it. It just was on so many levels historic.
I realize you're not done with the process yet, but how might this fabric be stored in the future once you're done? I mean, clearly it won't be in a wooden crate. What kind of materials would likely be used to preserve it in the crate itself?
Okay. So the rehousing project team that I was part of, we used aluminum sized pallets, about 4x4 and of other sizes, and we would use aluminum angle brackets and other, basically we used aluminum as the right now that's the standard, or at least we're trying to make that the standard, we build up whatever type of enclosure that it is that we need. My team, we made basically little cubes with a beveled top, so that when we then would also sew a fabric that's supposed to be fire resistant and water resistant, would go over it, so once it goes into whatever storage, here, at Ozzy, if there's a fire, then hopefully that fabric prevents any damage. If the sprinklers go off, that fabric will also prevent that. So for this one, again, it would more than likely again be built, the enclosure would be custom made to be able to hold these rolled fabrics. So necessarily each fabric might get its own separate pallet enclosure, and then any of the other hardware that I mentioned that was also stored with it, they'll also be stored on archival boxes with archival phones and everything else that's basically custom made. So it's not something
Josephina was on one of the earlier items that was housed was the Stringfellow model from 1889, which was flown at the Crystal Palace on a tram, but it was powered by a steam engine. And we wound up with the model because Langley was interested in the engine, but the model itself, probably the wood frame and some of the fabric is original. And so what we built was a pallet that was 13 feet long by 12 feet deep by about 6 feet high, I would say.
Yes.
About 6 feet high. And it's forkliftable, and it is storable, and it can be transported around, and it can go into one of our trucks and be transported that way. So this is going to be a much smaller package. It may be longer because it'll be 6 foot wide, but it'll be rolled. And so you could stack, theoretically, two rolls across and two rolls high, so that the fabric is on its own roll, and if it needs to be accessed at some point, it'll be on a roll. That roll can be removed. You wouldn't pull it off like tissue paper from the toilet roll. You would put it down on the table and roll it out. And then that would be probably the way that it would be done, but it would be accessible instead of it being at the bottom of the crate. So, yeah.
Yeah.
That's the plan.
There's another, the Albatross is on a pallet that is about 10 feet wide, 10 feet long by 6 feet deep, and about 5 or 6 feet high, with 3 layers or 3 levels of aluminum shelf. And on each one of those shelves are, a half dozen to 8 trays made out of ethafoam, inert foam, and inert and a acidic or in a chemically neutral cardboard that hold the various objects, and they're custom cut. Remember the Albatross with its curved fuselage. Josephina and Craig carefully cut to match the contours of the fuselage sections to support them while they're in those trays. And then the whole thing gets covered with Nomex. Just a big Nomex pavilion, as it were, over the whole thing.
The Nomex is the fabric that I had to sew.
So they're doing a very impressive job.
Any other questions or comments?
Could you, I know I've heard the term before, but could you describe what is Nomex?
I think Carl has a better explanation, but Nomex is a fabric. Does Kevlar sound familiar to you?
Yeah?
Okay, so it's very similar. The type of material that we're using is actually the grade that race car drivers use for when they get into their
Or flight
crashes.
suits.
Okay, so I've heard the term before associated with flight suits.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
That, and for the same reason, it's fireproof and it's water resistant, and so it will protect, should the sprinklers go off, it'll protect the objects from being in direct contact, and because it is not gonna catch fire,
Mhm.
under any circumstances that the contents wouldn't have already burst into flame because of internal, because of the just sheer thermal stress.
It's a non-flammable fabric. It will not combust.
It will not combust, it will not melt.
And it has hydrophil coating on it, so it sheds water. And when Josephina has enough extra material, she's gonna make me a raincoat. No, I'm only kidding.
I think somebody wanted a wedding dress made when they saw me at the sewing machine. Someone else asked for a teepee, and so I
It's
got-
bright yellow.
we got all kinds of requests. We had the neon yellow. Right now we're working on school bus yellow, and right after that we're actually down to a drab color black. So it's a colorful collection once all the objects are sorted together.
So we're doing the best that we can with the resources that we have at the moment to rehouse and store. And this particular object is of a large size, but we have yet a larger wing fabric from our
NC4.
the NC4. We have the original fabric from the NC4, and those are about 40-foot panels. So,
Keep it going.
When they get to rehouse that, I hope to be around photographing that one too, the same way. So,
anyone else?
In terms of relaxing the fabric
Mhm.
before it's rolled, is that like a chemical? What kind of
So
process?
the solvents so as of right now, in the textile conservation, there's several ways of relaxing. You can use just moisturize something with water and then press it down with weights and hopefully that'll be settled. This can't be so straightforward because of the dope on there. If we're able to and actually, even though it looks like the interior does not have any coating, it does. It still has that clear coat of the dope. So we have to be able to penetrate that dope layer, which is why we're gonna have to use some type of chemical mixture of some sort. As I mentioned, acetone is something that'll dissolve it, but we don't want to dissolve it. There have been other chemicals that were used historically that were also considered solvents to dissolve this in the process when they were making the dopes during the war. A lot of them are very toxic, so we don't want to have to use anything that's super toxic to a human on this object. But that still requires some testing that'll need to get addressed. But more than likely, what would happen, I think for the flak bait, what they had to do was create a humidity chamber for some of those wing panels that they had. But this is too large to create any type of humidity chamber, except the room that all these fabrics are currently stored in was once a painting booth. So I believe we would have the capability to make it a climate-controlled type of chemical environment there if we had to resort to a large type of, we need to expose some type of acetone solvent to again, we just want to soften, but what we don't want to do is chemically alter it so that then we end up with a sticky, we don't want it to be sticky. We don't want it to eventually start creating new cracks. So a lot of that, we still need to approach it with testing smaller pieces that we already have of it to try to see what we can do. So at this time, we're thinking chemically. We don't think we could just get an iron and just start ironing it. Like that won't work.
So Josephina has about 2 months to figure this out.
What else are you doing?
For real. That's what they pay me for.
Is there a protocol in terms of dope and whatever else is on the wings? Is there a there's for some time there's sort of been an issue of, to use a non-scientific term, like an outgassing of material. So when you roll it up, is there like, do you have to then sort of unroll it every year to sort of let
So,
it breathe?
that's a good
or how does
question.
that work?
There's a type of material that's called scavengers. And usually what's done is if, let's say this had been small enough that we could just make a box. You would put some of these scavengers, and usually they end up being such as like those desiccant bags you sometimes see when they're stuffed in the shoes or certain objects that you buy. Something similar to that, where then they would soak up any of this, what you call off-gassing. Some of this, so actually something we haven't mentioned yet was when they did remove it from the wooden crate, it had a heavy vinegary smell.
We walk into the paint booth and you can still smell it.
Every day you still walk in like, acid. So what that means is that it's the acetate that's coming off of the cellulose. So what's gonna happen is that as this is naturally decomposing, we'll probably have to consider whether in the enclosure that we make, if we might have to use some type of scavenger that'll soak it up. But if not, the material that'll be used, so when we're rolling it onto whatever size tube, envision that we're not gonna try to start rolling it up into a tight coil like you would a poster. This archival tube's gonna have to be of a significant diameter so that when it's rolling, it'll almost be as if the fabric isn't actually being curled at any point. It'll just still lie in a way that when it's rolled, we may still have to consider using some type of buffering material that will kind of soak up again any of the off-gassing. And in that case, something like that will require some collections manager to have to go in maybe every year, as you said, or every amount of time, maybe even as frequently as every 6 months. But usually when fabrics are rolled, they try really hard to not ever address that. So as I was indicating, it's quite possible that they'll have to use some sort of scavengers to soak up whatever's being eliminated off. And it's easier to replace those every so often, like, 6 months.
And they're like specific to dope or?
Well, there's all kinds, because certain ones only collect certain amount, like maybe if, for example, it was eliminating a more toxic, let's say if it was eliminating sulfur acid, then they have a specific type. Usually, I don't know what kind the museum has been using in the conservation lab in terms of scavengers, but they tend to be like a general one, an all-purpose kind. And more than likely, that should be sufficient for this one, because it's not as if the acetate's toxic to the environment, it's not toxic to humans, it's just a smell, and it's something that could unfortunately impact other objects within the collection storage. So, but if we also make these Nomex covers, there's a concern that maybe we don't mind having it off-gas because in the storage facility, they already have a filtration system that's designed to just remove it so that it's not even an issue. But those are good concerns, because even when we're dealing with the smaller sections of this fabric that do exist, how would we house those, and should we use scavengers? That's a good point.
All right.
You guys ready for lunch yet? You should be.